2, 1, and welcome, Mikey and YouTube and the other people who will be watching off Facebook, including us in the future. This is NSP, the New Civilization Project discussion. We're going to be unpacking Alain Badiou's The True Life. Short, sweet little text written by one of the most difficult, infuriating, and frustrating, redundant French philosophers currently alive, who comes from the same milieu as Jacques Derrida and Guy Deleuze and the rest of those people. So he's written this, though, for high schoolers, using mostly lectures that he gave at high schools in France. Because in France, you can still bring like philosophers to high schools, and I guess it's a thing that they do. So this is a book that we've had on the list for the all campus reads for the last like year, but we never really got to it because it always came in second choice on the votes. And so now we finally got to it, which is really exciting because the name of this club is technically inspired by this text.
How so?
There is a point in here when he says that what we need is a new symbolization. Ultimately, what he's laying out here is the situation that we find ourselves in today, young people, what the situation that we find ourselves in that is unique to our times, and how he suggests that we respond to it. Yeah, I guess the thing I'll say about NSP is that we're the sort of leftist group on campus that does theory, and we've been getting into performance art this semester. We've done some weird stuff, and we can talk about that off camera. I mean, really, we talked about it on YouTube last time. We've done some weird shit already.
I'm coughing. Go on.
Yeah. What else? Oh, we're organizing a conference for responding to Jordan Peterson that's happening in October 19th through 21st, and we're bringing one of the world's most renowned Marxian economists, Richard Wolff, as well as radical theologian Peter Rollins, and the podcast hosts from Symptomatic Redness, Zero Squared, and the Michael Brooks Show. So that's gonna be cool. And then we've got like between 10 and 15 like academics coming from all over the country, a couple from overseas, I think, will be presenting on the topic of responding to Peterson. Everyone's kind of coming at it in as mature and rigorous a way as they possibly can, from a variety of disciplinary focuses. I think that's my piece.
Multi-pronged attack.
Yeah, multi-pronged attack. And our goal is to shatter two illusions. One, that Peterson wants to engage in dialogue or debate. We've proven with this event that he doesn't want to do either because he canceled a debate with Douglas Lane, which is what inspired this whole thing in the first place. And then when offered a chance to debate Wolf, he said not for less than $50,000 after saying on the Joe Rogan podcast that Marxists refuse to engage in dialogue or debate. So, okay. And then the other illusion we're trying to shatter is that the left can't engage in rigorous or mature dialogue, right? That all we'll do is shout people down. Which, I mean, if it was Milo or if it was Shapiro, sure, why not? But with Peterson, it's like, hey, we were down. We were down to have a real talk. He didn't let us. Yeah, so, and with that, if you're ready, I was gonna hand it off to Anne. Not hand it off. We're gonna take turns. How about everybody who has read this, raise your hand. Sweet. Let's do it this way. Like, rather than go around and everyone just like, robotically take turns saying your name and like a couple of thoughts about it or whatever, when you talk, introduce yourself, and everyone make it a goal to say some things. And if you did not read it, all we ask is that you have a question, and I guarantee you will have a question, right? Like, there will be a question, because some of the shit we're going to say is going to be like, what? Explain that. And that will be helpful for all of us if you can bring to our attention the things that are not self-explanatory, because we've internalized the text now that we need to bring out to the open. So, would anyone like to lead off? Sweet.
It's going to be a series of things I didn't understand.
Perfect.
So, fun. So the whole first chapter I felt was missing a whole lot of explanation, because once I read the second chapter, I went back into the first one and skimmed over a bunch of stuff and suddenly understood a whole lot of it. There's a lot toward the end that I didn't get at all. There was
specifically the chapter on girls, or
no, toward the end of the first section that I didn't understand in the slightest. He talked about this. He talked about this like Greek thing, anabasis, anabasis. I don't know how to speak Greek, so I don't know how to pronounce it. He talked about how the sailors come back upon the sea and re-symbolize their old sailor selves. That one sentence gives me a whole lot of questions, because first of all, I don't think he, to me, explained clearly enough what symbolization is, because it seems like he's saying that symbolization is that which gives you meaning, when a symbol is the exact opposite, that which you imbue with meaning yourself, like words or symbols. They don't inherently have meaning, and they don't give meaning to anyone. It's the ideas that are expressed through the words that give people meaning. And so I was confused the whole time. And after I read section 2, I went back through section 1 to try to find where he explained what symbolization was. And I either didn't or I couldn't find it. That's the main thing I don't understand. But I also don't understand this going back up idea. I just don't know what he was trying to say with that at all.
Going back up meaning?
I can tell you.
Is going back up what you're saying the sailors did?
The word anabasis means to return by going back up. He says it's a wandering that returns or goes back out to a hard-to-reach destination. Like, as in, I imagined that your home is up on a hill, and he said something about how if you just stay in your home, it becomes a prison. But leaving your home and coming back, I guess, is supposed to be difficult. So that's why it's up on a hill in my mind. I don't understand why it's supposed to be difficult to come back when that's the thing you're comfortable with. At least that's the idea that he conjures when he talks about a home to me. So those are the two main things I don't understand. I don't understand the word anabasis, and I don't understand the word symbolization. But I really like the book.
with French philosophers, it tends to be the case that you have a lot of words that they don't just come right out and define, but everything kind of relies on it. And it's like, well, why is that? And usually it's like you're kind of assuming a lot about their audience, and then it can also just be that it's that sometimes their central ideas are the ones who are developing through the process, and that they don't want to oversimplify the terms. But that's not so much the case here, I don't think. So anyone have some ideas? I mean, Mikey, I'm kind of bummed I know you're in the situation where you're at the coffee shop and you won't be able to, but
no, I went outside for a minute.
Oh, sweet. Because I know Mike talks about symbolic orders, you know.
Can you hear me, Dave?
Yeah, I think we can all hear you, right?
Okay. So the computer froze up for a minute I think it was maybe on your end, but you're asking about how the best way to explain symbolization. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so even though, of course, he's not going to go into this, and I didn't get a chance to reread this. I wish I would have had it at the time, but I didn't. But when he's talking about symbolization, he's basically talking about what Lacan called the symbolic order. And so in France, even though he's writing this from far more of a general public than his other books, in France, they're going to know these kind of connotations without him actually spelling them out. And for Lacan, the symbolic order simply amounts to the configuration of our languages, our practices, our institutions, and it's basically the idea. Think about the feudalism. Feudalism as a society had a totally different structure than modern capitalist societies, and we can talk about them as having a different symbolic order than capitalism. Their principles, even their language, the very way that they went about semiotically making distinctions in the society, right? If you take the idea that God is the ultimate principle of things, then if somebody is born a king, then that's by God's decree. It's not arbitrary. It's not contingent. Whereas with us, in our symbolic order, we wouldn't think anybody's born with some sort of definite destiny like that. We think in terms of people are free to change what they are, to change. If you're born into a conservative family, you're free to become something else, right? If you're born into an atheist family, you're free to become religious. We don't think in terms of these sharply defined social positions having a kind of destiny to them. And it's precisely because of how our society as a semiotic system is organized. And so what Baudrillard, I've got Baudrillard on my mind. What Badiou means by new symbolization has to do with a new semiotic order, a new social system that would do away with vast majorities of the problems that are caused by our capitalist symbolic order. And that's what he has in mind when he's talking about new symbolization. The word symbol here, it doesn't really translate well. It's not how we talk. I think semiotic is better because we think of it in terms of signs and that things. We think of symbols like, I don't know who suggested it, but we think of them more in terms of like sentimental values or something like that. Not like broad linguistic semiotic categories. And that's what he's getting at here is the semiotic system that organizes a specific society. Hold on, Dave, I think the volume went way down, but I didn't hit anything on my end.
Oh, really? I'm talking just as loud as I was before.
That's a little better. That's better. Keep going.
Maybe
Can you go a little more?
because I put you on the coffee table so that we could hear you better.
Maybe I was hearing you better with my headphones.
Maybe it also helped when you saw me. Yeah, I don't know.
That's better too. I can hear you now.
Weird. Okay. Yeah, this works. Okay.
All right, was that at all helpful?
That was really helpful. Elijah said that was really helpful. He was the one that asked the question, but
Okay.
I mean, we're all nodding. So, Sky, welcome.
That
So-
is where I left my wallet.
Do you want to sit on this with us or over there? Sit. All right. So basically, we opened with questions, and one of the main questions was, what's a symbolic order, or what's a symbolization in the way that Alain Badiou is talking about it? Because obviously, he thinks that we need a new one. And Mikey just gave us an exquisite breakdown. And essentially, it's languages, practices, institutions, right? We've internalized a variety of thought and behavior patterns that all come out of, that all work within the social context that we're in here. And one of the points that Badiou's getting at is that a lot of this is like residue, leftovers of older worlds, older symbolic orders that don't make sense anymore. And so the first lecture in here, you know, he's giving to a general audience. The second lecture he's giving to a classroom full of boys. I'm imagining like an assembly hall, right? Then the other one is for girls. He talks about what's the plight of boys, what's the plight of girls, you know, and it's very like on this gender binary, but like so is the class. I mean, so is the assemblies he's speaking to, right? And but one of his main points with the chapter to girls was just that, like, you know, girls have traditionally had to, you know, think about how they're going to become women. They have like a very limited set of options for ways that people can make sense of them, right? Yes. And so, so this is just one example of how an old symbolic order kind of sticks with us, but it doesn't really fit anymore. It doesn't really make sense anymore, and so we want to figure out some new way of going about it. Is kind of what he's getting at. So, and he also talks about it in terms of codes and regulations. I had a couple pages. I'm not sure if our page number is going to be the same, but on 36 and 37. It says the whole traditional civilization was thus based on the order structure that assigned people's places, and therefore the relations between these places. Right. So this goes right back to what Mikey was saying about feudalism, and about how, you know, there's this ideology of the divine right of kings, where we just believed that they were born into this sort of destiny that they were fulfilling. The abandonment of tradition as achieved by capitalism as a general system of production, trade, and ultimately places in society did not actually propose any real civilization, but only the ruthless, arbitrary, free play of the economy, the neutral, asymbolic reign of what Marx so brilliantly called the icy water of egotistical calculation. Right? Everyone's looking out for themselves. And he talks about this a lot in the boy chapter. Is this the boy chapter? Yeah. No, but he talks a lot in the boy chapter about how we've lost objective criteria or objective rites of passage for achieving adulthood. Yeah.
I'm reminded of the walking hypothesis. If you have a given language, then you're constricted in the ways you think because of the nature of the symbols. And I wondered how much of that actually carries on. I mean, he's talking about a much higher sphere than of natural languages.
Yeah, simply lacking words for various colors, right, can make those like not jump out in perception, right? What are the broader effects that compile at the social level when we have outdated ways of talking about things? Elijah, did you have more questions?
Well, there's the whole other part. Yeah, the whole.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this is in the first book of the Wasteland. You guys read the Wasteland recently? So actually, I might pull it up to read it. It's this intensely nostalgic turn to youth, where basically we begin in a space that is like a desolate wasteland covered by snow, and nothing can grow up from the snow. So once spring comes, it won't actually happen. It'll just melt away. It'll be a barren wasteland, and nothing will be able to come out of it. The second scene in that section is basically this extremely nostalgic image of youth pushing themselves down like sort of sleigh hill. And in this moment, we're like, you know, these class markers of like when we used to go to the Archduke's house, when we used to go to like, there's these incredibly strange sort of moments of nostalgia for this youth, and for youth that would easily be like, you'd be given a title, and through that title, you would eventually be able to sort of be like, oh, I'm an adult now. And there's I mean, this entire book, I mean, sort of centers around the idea that there's no possibility of like ever not becoming, or actually becoming an adult, because there's no rite of passage, there's no anything like that. But this idea of an anabasis, where you are going out and basically looking back, maybe through poetry, through recollection, through anything to sort of render this sort of nostalgic past, doesn't actually. I feel like there's a way in which, has anyone here read like Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism recently? It's, I don't know, I'm sorry, I realize literary, I'm so deep in literary. Yeah, but Lauren Berlant sort of imagines this idea of like what she calls like cruel optimism. And in cruel optimism, basically, you imagine the possibility in your past of a sort of like neoliberal perfection. So you imagine the possibility of a neighborhood, the possibility of all these things, but no one actually living really has that. And there was that sort of thing never actually existed. And so there's a way in which like this looking back is sort of, I mean, to me, it doesn't actually seem possible. The idea of an anabasis isn't actually, ever really feasible. Yeah, it's not feasible whatsoever. And it's like, there's this intense anxiety between, of being young here, whereas like there's the self-destructive behavior, living in the present, and then there's the living sort of in the future. It seems like there's no way of actually living in the past here. Right. And so this sort of like, the nostalgia here is actually, really kind of strange and like less than possible.
So I think he gets at this a little better in the boys chapter.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a summary of the boys chapter in the girls chapter. I forget which, but like he's going to. So you kind of got it. There's these two options that we're all faced with. The one we're torn between these options: burning versus building. Right? You burning is like living in immediacy. It's hedonism. It's sex, drugs, rock and roll, and not minding, not thinking about the future. Whereas the other one is building for basically to be a successful person at some class level in society, right? And so it's all about securing your privileges within that space, or getting to that space so you can like camp out within the existing order, right? And I think he's going to get a bit more into the other. There's a reactionary. He does get into the reactionary way of dealing with that, with the sacrificial body, which is like the traditional self. And then he also gets into like a new way. He hints at it. I don't know how. Yeah.
Well, just going back on the whole burning versus building, I think that's really interesting. To think about being like a college student right now, seeing everyone kind of taking one of those two paths. And so I was just pondering, can we enjoy both? Should we be enjoying neither of those? And how do we deal with these things how do we deal with that, and how do we prepare ourselves for the future, but at the same time enjoy what's happening right now, but then also try to escape this system of just, I'm either going to waste my life right now and drink and do drugs and vomit at 2 in the morning, or am I just going to study, prepare myself for the future? And so I don't know. I just thought I feel like I'm kind of in that right now, and I'm experiencing that. And then he talks about, is youth a good thing? Is it the best time of our lives, or is it a scary time? Is it really, is it tough? And I think that was also interesting too, because as a young person, I don't really sit and think like, is my time as a young person good or bad? I'm just kind of like living it. And I feel like, again, it's both. And it's those struggles and all the old people thinking that we don't have good ideas and that we're not important. That it's the failures that like make our youth really good, but it's also, I think, our optimism. And I don't know, I think youth is a really important time of our life, because we haven't gotten into the system yet, and we haven't experienced the effects of capitalism as much. Yeah. So I don't know. I just that all is really interesting to me, and it's just like how do we deal with all of that? How do we live our lives then?
The answer for that would be that we have to be more romantic, like political romantic. Because if we see this new symbolization, it's going to be hard to accomplish that because there are two main enemies in the United States: the Constitution and its institutions. Because the Constitution, many people feel proud of the Constitution that has lasted for over 200 years. But this is the main reason that people are like the main two reasons here: the foreign like, dependency of this. They cannot create a new thing. And well, the other things I want to say is that if we want to change, we want to bring something new, like prevent something from the worst, but we have to bring a new change in this political system. And seeing that in the 19th century there was this life of all these liberators and that were fighting for something great all the time, everywhere, because there were no these institutions established in those times. It seems to me that these times right now it's like there's not a visible future that's the same because the easy things that were possible in the past now are difficult to accomplish.
What's really interesting to me about the sort of distinction between builders and burners is that we sort of all know builders and burners.
Yeah.
And so often, the people that are builders, people that imagine the future, become the bourgeois class. And very often, as well, people that are burners, people that sort of tend towards self-destructive behavior because of how anxious the sort of society is making us become proletarians, like almost exclusively. And I think this is like sort of forwarded by like Althusser's like ideology and ideological state apparatuses, this whole section on schools and that. Because the section on schools imagines, and actually Badiou sort of gets to this a little bit, where he went to a specialized school that a lot of his contemporaries went to that school, and his sort of like classmates went on to become like people who have $1 million or $1 billion startups, etc. People that are sort of builders, it seems like, how do I even sort of put this? Like, yeah, I'm going to actually just leave it. But you don't sort of talk
Well, he
about
says that
like,
there's a sense in which the school, and then at some other point he mentions the police, disproportionately is grooming and separating out basically the wheat from the chaff, right? Like they're setting up the deserving people, and they're separating them from these people who are not going to be deserving of their rank and status in the society. Right?
The builders are new producers. They're reproduction and the social order of things. And like, it seems interesting that that whole section doesn't necessarily have a lot of class analysis. It's sort of creating this dichotomy, but it's not actually sort of listing the implications of what happens when there's young people that are either way. Because it's like, I don't know which I want to be. I've done both. I prefer to be a builder, but I also don't want to like build a class structure.
Yeah.
Fucking sucks. But yeah.
Can I kind of like springboard off of that?
Yeah.
And keep going. There was like toward the end of the boys section, I think. I don't actually know where I am because I'm on Kindle, but I'm somewhere in the boys section. There's this quote because there's that Dave was talking about the sacrificial body and the perverted body were the two, I think.
Yeah.
And somewhere in between there's the deserving body, you just kind of settle in and just follow the rules of the society. But then he says toward the end of that section, he says that the only recourse against the deserving body is in the inherent disinterestedness. Is that right? Disinterestedness of intellectual creativity, which to me, I immediately highlighted that sentence because I knew I wanted to talk about it, because just yesterday I went and I bought a bass guitar, almost on a whim. Like I'm a musician. I've been a musician my whole life. And I decided I wanted to move on to bass. I said I wanted to move into different types of music and start writing the kind of music that I listen to. And it feels like I'm pursuing my own passion. And then when I read that, it was like, because I'm sure we all have the times where you're frustrated that you can't become happy. Like you're just unhappy all the time. That's every winter for me. And then it feels like pursuing that intellectual creative passion. Pursuing that creative passion creates the disinterestedness in the established order that you're searching for, I guess. I don't really remember where I was going with that, but that was that one section was something that felt pretty cool to me right after I went and bought a bass guitar.
And I'd actually like to discuss that too, because it's in the voice section, I believe, where he talks about education and the perverted body and the deserving body. He says that like moving on to a higher education has kind of turned into the initiation for boys instead of the initiation into adulthood of going into the military. But he says that the public education is no better than the military because the problems exist, such as dismantlement, privatization, social segregation, blah blah blah. So I wondered, if schools aren't teaching us at least teaching us the important things, thinking, critical thinking, where do we learn? When do we learn how to think, and when do we think? And so it's kind of up to the individual to take on that initiative, to go out and to do something creative, to do what we're doing here, talking about theory and philosophy. But I feel like not a lot of people do that just because it's inconvenient, it's hard. And so, will we ever escape then? Will we ever escape this system if people aren't going out and taking initiative to gain insightful knowledge and to critically think and to really learn just outside of a classroom where it's, this is chemistry, this is blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I just thought that was really interesting. And it's just how do we escape that if not everyone is willing to take on that challenge?
Or does participating in some group like this really, how does this fit into your being a Democrat or being a Republican in this country, right? How does this somehow fit into that project? Because the thing is like, ultimately, depending on what kinds of business ladder you're trying to build yourself or climb up, if you're trying to be very successful in this country, you're probably trying to figure out, am I a Democrat or am I a Republican? Am I religious? If I'm religious, what sect am I? And then once you kind of figure those things out, it's really just about learning how to talk and walk like one, so that you can fit within that culture, so that you can secure that space for yourself, right? Yeah. And the thing is like something like this doesn't even make sense if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, like you want to try so hard to find your identity as soon as possible, so you can just fit into that and not have to worry about it anymore. Like, oh yeah, this is what I'm gonna do with my life. These are my political beliefs. I'm done. And I feel like not enough people.
But some people, that's just fine.
Yeah, but then we're just still stuck in that system and that cycle of never questioning the system and never trying to escape it and never criticizing it.
We're trying to wear old clothes, for that matter, or put old wine in. Old wine in new wineskins, right? Yeah, because it's like even if that's what you think you want, you might find out that it's not going to work. And this is where a lot of that nostalgic kind of yearning for the American dream, like, oh, if we could only just have that thing that only ever really existed for a handful of people in the first place. But if I could only just have that thing, right? And well, why? Well, because you're trying to check all the boxes to get that thing that's literally unattainable anymore. Like, how many people in our generations are seriously looking at, like, or taking seriously of being a homeowner at this point, right? Like, the idea seems absurd to most people at this point, when that's such an essential part of the American dream. So it's like, yeah, I was just throwing on top of what you were saying, though, that it
Yeah, well, I was going to add something.
Yeah.
You know, that the challenge that you said. I think that the immediacy is the money. So if the intellectual knowledge is not going to give you any immediate reward, so it's probably you're not going to see it in your life. Probably your children are the future of the country.
Yeah.
And the intellectual creativity is going to take time. But that's it has to be, you don't have to get looking for a reward when you're looking for the truth, which is the knowledge of the whole knowledge.
Yeah, and in the boys section, he talks about how, like, the son in specific, it's hard for him to find his own identity, and so he starts talking about commodity circulation. And there's one quote on page 57: "The imperative of action that led to the son's pact becomes commodity circulation. The imperative that was the law becomes production of inertia." And so he talks more about that, and then a couple pages later, still talking about, like, the whole circulation of commodity and basically, like, money and the desire to be able to buy things to live. He says, "For this very reason, the individual is gradually prevented from becoming the subject he or she is capable of." So, like, that need and desire for money is basically preventing us from being individuals and from really establishing our own identity and continuing to learn things, because we're so focused on just being able to survive and to buy food. And yeah.
the silence is more of a commentary on how good the pizza is, because we're all like mouths full enjoying.
You know, I would just raise the question. I mean, part of what he's getting at here, on some level, we have this crisis of what adulthood even means. And as he, you know, boys never really get to achieve adulthood anymore. We're perpetually boys. People my age, us Gen Xers, just flood into the barcades to relive our glory days at the mall, at the arcades now, of course. And, you know, he argues that women, for the most part, are forced to be adults from an early age, and they don't get the same type of childhood boys get. And it really becomes more of a question of what would a robust, fruitful concept of adulthood be, and at the same time, what would a meaningful childhood look like? And I think more and more, we don't seem to have any criteria to define these. And if anything, this book, instead of providing answers, it raises important questions. And I think that is important. I think more and more that, you know, with the ubiquity of childhood, especially with men, this is kind of like, you can use the Baudrillardian principle, right? That the more and more you expand something like a virus, the more it dissipates and it doesn't really have much identity whatsoever. And you could say that it's precisely because none of us get any real childhood anymore that we have nostalgia for it. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I like these questions that he's raising. And I don't know, the people, I've gone out of my way to ask people, men and women about this, and most people tend to agree with what he has to say about the genders, right? I don't think he's doing anything truly like gender essentialism. He's saying that this is how this symbolic order that we live in has effectively shaped these positions in the symbolic order. And so, yeah, I just think it's important to think about what would a meaningful adulthood be? What kind of criteria could we even think of to draw the line between childhood and adulthood? And I mean, for us, anytime I think of adulthood, I think of the Breakfast Club line. Adulthood is where your heart dies, right? And what would it be to have an adulthood where it's not soul crushing? You're not just completely given over to trying to have a successful career, right? What would it be to have an adulthood that, in a sense, serves you and you not serve it? Okay, I'll stop talking now.
No, it's really good. And you're right that he's not laying out his prescription for the solution. He, a child of the 60s that he is, a lifelong revolutionary that he is a self-identified communist. But he's always, in these kinds of conversations, not trying to push people to join a party because he's not a party person. For him, it's an idea. It's an idea that's had a lot of really miserable, failed experiments, and that he's not exactly sold on the solution being a statist approach. Like the solution to the idea might not come from the state, because we've seen how bad the state can, become in its totalitarian modes. So he's not trying to say, oh, I've got it all figured out, because he was totally like an on-board Maoist at one point, and now he's disillusioned. Instead, he's just like, no, this is an idea that's been alive since Plato. Socrates was killed for it, actually. And so it's an idea worth keeping alive, but we have to be thinking now more than ever, what would an egalitarian symbolization look like? Because the stakes are higher. And he says that we're on the precipice of a new age in a lot of ways, primarily because we live in a multicultural world where all of the symbolic orders of all these different nation states that function pretty well, more or less, for a long time, no longer function, and they're all crashing into one another. And that's typically, called postmodernism. And basically the only thing that really survives under postmodernism is capitalism, which, its only symbolic order is kind of centered around the commodity and the individual vis-a-vis capital itself, which is going to be whoever has accumulated enough of it to wield power in that system. And you can keep culture alive by having little microcultures like what we have here. You can keep culture, it's transient. It's not going to last that long. You can have a church, but, if you go into many churches these days, they're pretty transient themselves. A lot of them are tombstones, if anything. Or, you go to cultural events and it's people celebrating what their culture used to be like. Right? And it's right before it was wiped out in this collision of cultures, and especially by empire and capitalism and stuff like that. So one of the things I find inspiring in it is that he's saying that it's essentially got to be a multi-generational struggle, that it's not going to, not one of us is going to go into a lab and then come out we fixed it. And it's not like our generation would be able to fix it. It's going to be people figuring out ways of sustaining revolution as a way of life, which is actually what Badiou's lifelong project has been. Is May 68 was the craziest month in human history if you were in France. Besides the actual French Revolution, it was May 68 was when everyone stopped doing anything for a month and was having real authentic conversations with strangers and, sharing goods and occupying buildings and,
Be reasonable. Demand the impossible.
And it was just absolutely mind-blowing for the people involved with it. But then after life moved on, Most people sold out. They just joined the system. Some people became complete reactionaries and said, fuck the system. And there's two ways of becoming a reactionary and saying, fuck the system. One is by just, partying. And the other one is by becoming like a religious fundamentalist. So it's like you have the sellouts, those are the deserving bodies. Then you've got the reactionaries in the hedonistic form and the sacrificial form. The sacrificial is just the fundamentalist. And I just outlined what he's calling the three bodies. If you found it weird that he's calling them bodies, it's because biopolitics comes out of, largely France, and Italy, but biopolitics is the management of bodies, the administration of bodies from the state capitalist, way of seeing things. And that these, and also part of it, is that bodies are visceral, bodies are the things that endure or dish out violence. And he's he's speaking about lost boys, and so he talks about the kinds of violence that comes from the extremes of these three bodies. One, so the deserving, the sellout, ladder climber body. This person, in its extreme form, becomes the person who's won the world but sold their soul in the process. They're the person who says, "Oh, fuck it, we're going to decimate this village," when the stakes are high. Or they're the one who essentially screws a family over in a lawsuit because it's advantageous for their corporation, whatever. These are the politicians, implicated in the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers, or just any politicians for that. Then you've got, what are the other two bodies? Deserving. Perverted, yeah, the perverted hedonistic one, especially for a bunch of quote unquote boys running, he says that the extreme tendency in terms of the violence that comes from this is gang rape, which is also all sorts of criminalized behavior. But the idea is when you've completely renounced the symbolic order of whatever kind of world you live in. He says it's the ideology of no future. You don't believe that there's any future in the symbolic order that you're a part of, so you build your own, and that in its worst manifestations, this tends to manifest as a game. Then he talks about the extreme form of the fundamentalist, which is obviously fundamentalist terrorism. So you've got white nationalists shooting up churches, etc. But then there's also this sense in which you can't really. So for Kierkegaard, it was actually Mikey who drew my attention to this, that all three of those correlate with Kierkegaard's three spheres of life, right? The aesthetic would be the hedonistic, the perverted. The ethical would be the ladder climber, sellout. And then the religious sphere for Kierkegaard is what he's calling the sacrificial, which is the fundamentalist, traditionalist. And the funny thing about this is that for Kierkegaard's saying there's these two are not options, the ethical and the hedonistic. These are not, the ladder climber and the hedonistic are not options. He's saying, for me, it's going to be this latching on to some old ideology, right? Well, and you take the leap of faith and you latch onto that old ideology, and that is where a lot of extremism comes from, and a lot of fundamentalism. And so Badiou's saying, well, even Kierkegaard's solution doesn't work. So he wants to have another option. Yeah, go away.
It's just worth adding too. The perverted body, the one that rejects the symbolic order entirely. I think there's some resonance of Zizek's theory of violence, where violence is a way of attempting to express yourself when you can't express yourself symbolically. You can't put into words what the problem is. And so it makes sense that those people who have decided to live outside of the symbolic order use violence as a way to go about trying to express themselves. So I would just, it's almost an aside, but I see some of Zizek's theory of violence there.
And Hannah Arendt basically not only distinguishes but calls the opposite of violence not non-violence but power, and the idea that when violence is used by a state when they're actually having a loss of power, when there's a loss of sort of the symbolic order, then thus they use violence as a sort of aid. When the Kent state, protests are going on and they become out of control, and it's starting to realize that the state doesn't have the power, that's where the National Guard comes in and starts gunning people down. It's an absolute sort of show, and that's, kind of all right. And I think Zizek is sort of quoting or sort of referencing back to not only Arendt's on violence, but also Benjamin's critique of violence as well. Which is
No, that's good.
Yeah.
But I'll just throw in the for Kierkegaard, he wrote the book Either or. Generally, so for Hegel, there's always, and this is like simplistic take on Hegel, but it's also somewhat true. There's always the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis, right? So you have these juxtaposed worldviews or understandings or arguments, and rather than one being right and the other being wrong, the trajectory of history is that there's always like a new idea that surpasses both. It takes the best of both and leaves the worst. But then that one finds another, antagonism, and this just continues, right? But this happens in like systems, right? And Marx takes this analysis to material conditions of reality. But Kierkegaard was a critic of Hegel and said, in our existential lived lives, though, there's not always syntheses. Sometimes you have to choose either or. And he's saying that you cannot really succeed at climbing the ladder in the ethical body, the deserving body, and you can, while simultaneously trying to be the hedonistic person, right? If you're going to fully immerse yourself in, I'll just take the music scene for instance, and it's like you're pretty much partying and going to music and enjoying art and trying, probably having some great sex. And like for me, it was the music scene for like a pretty long time before I went to college. That would be the perverted body. It's like punk. I just think punk, or hardcore. It counts for hippies too. But you can't do that and be a ladder climber at the same time, right? Now you could be kind of ladder climbing while working at Ross, right? And a lot of my friends who are still doing that, and they're doing it really well, and I'm proud of them, and a lot of them are musicians, they're doing great. They are. Have worked your way up into management level positions at places like Pita Pit or Best Buy. And, they really are managing to balance these things probably better than a lot of the people going through that scene. I couldn't balance it very well. I could just, I could not last at any job for more than 2 years tops, and part of the reason is they have kids, right? And really at the end of the day, they stop partying as much. And so they still go to shows, like maybe 5 shows a year. They see their old friends, but ultimately now they're parents and they're just working that job. So now they're back at the deserving, but because they spent those formative years in their 20s not ladder climbing, this is pretty much like where they're going to be at. And it's a decent life within the system that we live in. It's obviously not like this one that completely sells its soul. But for Kierkegaard, he'd say, look, if you're going to do one well, you got to do it. You got to go all out. Badiou's saying, yeah, but you're going to fucking kill yourself, and you're also going to kill the world. Because the other thing is that if you're not going with the reactionary options of the traditional sacrificial or the perverted aesthete, if you're not going with those reactionary positions, the ladder climbing one fundamentally plays into the capitalist state empire apparatus that is decimating the world, that does sign like the end of any possible futures whatsoever because of that ecological devastation alone. Much less like the possibilities of really distributing resources even remotely equally, because there won't be a lot of resources to go around. And whenever there's not a lot of resources to go around, the people who thrive are always going to be the fascists, because they always do a scapegoating thing that they do, where they're, oh, well, it's these people's fault. So that's the pickle. that we're in, he's saying. Does that make sense? Does anyone think I left anything out? Does anyone have any problems with it? Does anyone?
This is beginning to sound like the three laws of thermodynamics. You can't win, you can't break even, and you can't even leave the game.
Damn, we just found the.
I told you
Three laws of-
I told you with the king of pit.
That's right.
In politics, some people can express themselves, like Obama, there was a man that everybody thought that he would create a new civilization because he's African American. No other country has a president, white population. So, but as soon as if you see his speeches before he was president, he was radical. But as soon as he was in office, he moderated his speeches, and it's when the institutions and everything changed his mind. I think that at some point the politicians and some leaders can express themselves, but it doesn't progress.
I think that was. I mean, in the typical cultural narrative, that was where a lot of people got pretty disillusioned with any serious kind of change coming from the top within the U.S. So, I mean, there's a couple sections on like where he goes a little bit into some solution type things, but I was thinking we could like spend some time on women.
Okay, actually, like really quickly wanted to go into the solutions. There's one section on page 44. I don't know what that is in the PDF version. It's like almost close to the end of that first section. But he says, I would say that a connection needs to be made between the two being the burning up of one's life and the building it. There is what you want to build, what you're capable of, but there are also the signs of what compels you to leave, to go beyond what you're able to do, build or settle into, the power of departure, building and leaving. There's no contradiction between them, being able to give up what you're building because something else has beckoned you toward the true life. And I guess one of my biggest questions is, like, how do you find out what you're capable of? And how, like, what does beckon you? I don't know. I was just wondering that, like, I guess how does that happen?
I like that quote. I think it gets at one of the fundamental problems, which is young people really aren't in any type of position to explore what they actually want to end up doing with their lives. I mean, your late teens and your early to mid 20s should really be, let me dive into architecture. Let me dive into psychology. Let me dive into music, right? And do all of these sorts of experiments. And it sounds cliche, but really find yourself, right? Find what you really are passionate about. Find what you really want to devote your time to and build. And there's just little to no options for this anymore for young people. And so it does. I mean, you can't blame young people for having some sort of immediate desire to just destroy, because they're not even permitted the opportunities it would take to be able to build something. And so I think we get into the fundamental problem of young people especially, not having the time, money, or resources to be able to find themselves.
Rather have the time, or you have the money, or you have the resources. I mean, it's like, yeah, you can't have all three.
And like personally speaking, I want to pursue acting and I want to get into acting, but I'm like, I know I can't do that right now because I need a job. I need to make money. And so it all comes back down to the whole money problem, and that I feel like is one of the biggest things that is deterring us and preventing us from really going out and exploring and being able to just discover and try new things, because there's always that concern of, I need to buy groceries, I need to pay for school, just things like that. So
certain Marxists critiqued Heidegger for saying, Marcuse did this. He said, Heidegger acts like his phenomenology is radically concrete, and when in fact it's really abstract, because there's nothing in there about, I'm kind of expanding on his insight, but Heidegger doesn't talk about the necessities of Dasein, having to eat, or, all of the basic requirements. It's all about us having a project and pursuing that, and how that organizes our whole existence, our future. And this is where I would say that Heidegger gets at something right, which is if all you're living for day to day is your bare subsistence, you're not existing at all in any robust, meaningful way. And yeah, we got to have our basic necessities met, but if that's all we have, we're not really doing anything human. And you can say that that's precisely, I feel like there's some implicit Heideggerian aspect here where he's saying, what does a meaningful, to talk about the true life is to talk about, in some way, shape, or form, authentic existence, meaningful existence. And yeah.
Even if you get to a certain class level where you do not have to worry about sustenance, etc., and even if you are a critical theorist for a living, or a poet, someone who is reaching out toward the unknown and trying to make sort of new, or make something else, there's a way in which you're still completely in the superstructure of not only the educational system but of language and stuff, like we were talking about earlier. There's a way in which even if you do sort of get to take on and appreciate life, or Marx always idealized, oh, well, I'll just fish today and then do this tomorrow and then this. It's when you're inside of this system, there's actually no way to even think about novelty. And it's we're actually using our language is intensely steeped in forms of misogyny, forms of anything. There's the word where we get the word household from, in Greek, oikos, which is just the boring word for household, and some yogurt that Danik makes. Right. That is a word that used to include all of the slaves that the patriarch of the warlord owns, all the female wards. Our language is so based in sort of oppression that even using it to try and reach out toward novelty can't really make it. Even poetry, it's the attempt to sort of speak toward novel ideas, or conceptualize shit. This is why it turns to it so often. Form is an intense superstructure that forces writers to write in a certain manner. And a lot of the forms sort of steeped are initially in white supremacy.
yeah.
Great, thank you.
Steeped in bullshit. So it's I actually don't know if I would even be this optimistic. Just sort of, it's a thing. Yeah. I don't know.
Someone said to me this week also that something that Marx got wrong was that he was overly optimistic, that if you were able to get people a lot more leisure time, that they would use it in ways that build culture, or really develop the self. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And their response was that they have observed this when people actually in their lives were able to free up the time, and they filled that with all these other things. And I was like, well, you're judging this off of observations of people that you've seen within this society. And they were like, well, yeah, but but I see it though. And I was like, but you're missing okay. So so I thought about it for a couple of days, and I think the one of the most important things are, first of all, how do you judge what another person's fulfilling use of time is, right? But the bigger thing though is that it's not so time and surplus time and energy is what's necessary for any sort of meaningful activity, period. But if you look at statistics, people who are unemployed and they are receiving their unemployment benefits are extremely, extremely depressed, and they're not, building producing culture, building community, or developing themselves, which are pretty much like the three things you can do with surplus time and energy. So, well, why? And that's the other component, though, which is there are a couple of other components, but one of the most important components is the possibility of recognition from a meaningful community. And that if you look at human societies anthropologically, like, it tends to be the case that there are systems in place where you're able to attain recognition for various feats. These might be rites of passage, but they also just might be like learning a dance. There's no dance that is like the Boise dance, and everyone knows it. And if there was, it would probably suck at this point, because it would probably be on that freaking turf, But there's no like unifying thing like that. And in a certain sense, Zizek says that that's liberating in a way, right? Because alienation has its dark side, but it also has this other side where now your neighbor doesn't give a shit what you do, and you wouldn't want them to. So that's kind of nice, right? So it's good that we don't all have to do the same dance, right? But to have access to communities of potential recognition is obviously like one of the things that the unemployed person is lacking. And obviously there's also like the resources. So, and then there's just 1,000 different ways that you can achieve that. And it really depends on what your own talent and interests are. So.
Dave, just to piggyback on what you're saying, I mean, we also have to take into account that not only are we dealing with ourselves at this conscious level of the ego, we can sit here all day and say, I don't care about what other people think of me. I don't care about what capitalist society thinks of me, but our unconsciouses do. And this is where you go into Lacan, you realize how much bearing the big other has on us. We are always measuring ourselves in terms of the big other, and simply declaring our not giving a fuck about it doesn't change the fact that we are through and through determined by it and measure ourselves in terms of it. And so if you're unemployed, yeah, you can think through it and go, this is arbitrary that people think I'm a loser. It's completely contingent and arbitrary. My society considers this bad. But nonetheless, no matter how much you think through it, it does still affect people. And, it's only capitalist ideology that acts like we're so individualistic, where we can just totally choose not to care about how our society views us.
Yeah, well, capitalism itself is not individualistic. It's just the ideology.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's Baudrillard's main point early on, is that all of the individualism in capitalism is totally simulatory, or in other words, bullshit.
Well, we're at it. We're 7 minutes from close. So let's do like, anybody want to do some recapitulating or questions you've had kind of hanging on there? Other points that are important that you want to?
We wanted to get into the
women
section.
Girls, yeah.
Yeah,
This is important.
That's important.
Yeah, we can make that 15 minutes if we need to, because let's make sure we do this justice.
Well, okay, so he talks about so the fact that women kind of don't ever have that girls don't have the initiation into womanhood, because they're kind of just expected from the beginning to be like a woman, and they just really are one from such a young age, and it's kind of premature. But I thought it was interesting what he actually thinks constitutes like being a woman, and like what makes a girl a woman. And he talks about how that their knowledge includes how to dress, body care, like reading magazines. I think we were talking about this earlier today. He talks about how girls, they read magazines on how to dress, body care, shopping, how to please men, sex, all these things. And that was kind of all he talked about on what makes a young girl similar to a woman. But it's so much more sophisticated than that. And there are so many more social elements, how we, from such a young age, we know how to behave around different people, how to avoid unwanted contact by men, how to avoid getting raped, what to do when we're in those types of situations. And so it's a lot more just maturity rather than like, oh, we just act like women and dress like women. It's a lot more of a mental thing.
It's also like something that you're forced into in such a way, because you're told when you're like 6 years old, girls mature faster than boys. And is it that they mature faster, or that they're pushed into that maturity in a much different way? And like, my copy of The True Life is still in the mail. It's been 2 weeks. I'm very sad. But really, it's a lot more complicated than just like, oh, we made maggots. Like, and the way that you're basically forced into this idea that your whole identity, whether you realize it or not, is based on pleasing men, is really wild, and like something that you don't even realize you're doing. The way that, just societal expectations of what you have to do are all based in making yourself more attractive to men. And it's wild and awful, and things that like I still realize, like I still have moments where I realize, I'm doing this because I'm not doing this because this is what I want to do. It's because of what I was taught, and the reason I was taught this was because of this other reason.
And then when he talks about how the girls are always mature and the men are more childlike, it feels like we can't even escape that system, because the childlike boys and men will always be dependent on the women, and the women will never be able to escape that prematurity when the men are acting childish. So it's just like stuck in this cycle of dependency on each other and dependency on the other group to act that way, so we can respond to it, and so the men can respond and just live off of the women's maturity.
Yeah, when I read this in a class, mostly women in this class that I was in, they were a part of the reflection was, they went into this kind of like heckles race, like what's this guy gonna say, and then they were like overall like, pretty accurate actually, except that and one of the women brought up this point that just think of comedies, most of them are about man boys, right? Like it's the traditional romance now, like the 40-Year-Old Virgin or whatever. And they have toys and they have a man cave and all of these things, right? Whereas if the women are gonna go crazy for a little while, like in Broad City or something like that, which is a great show, and they're just going buck wild, and they're having sex with anyone they want to, they're experimenting with drugs, they're drinking, etc. They're not playing with toys still. They're still not playing with toys, and ultimately they're treating it like it's a phase thing, whereas like guys are often just like, this is life now.
I'll add one of the things that makes I feel like. Oh, okay.
Sorry. So it's back from, I see this all the time. I see it in my mom's relationship with her husband, and just everywhere. The way that women are expected to be caretakers, they run the home, they clean it, they cook, and men aren't expected to do those. And even if they are, not at the same rates and quality that women are expected to do it. You go from having a mother to take care of you to then having a girlfriend who's going to take care of you, and to having a wife that's going to take care of you. Like you're allowed to be a kid because you have a parent there in the partner that you're supposed to have. Which, yeah.
Mike.
Sorry, Sky. I couldn't hear you talking until I turned the camera.
It's all good.
The other problem, so I think this section is the hardest to understand, at least parts of it, because in the background is Lacan's theory of sexuation from Seminar 20. And he talks about the phallus and all this. And as much as I've studied Lacan, I still can't get a Lacanian to give me a clear answer on what the phallus even means. Oh, well, the phallus is a signifier. Oh, well, that's helpful. Great. Okay, what signifier is the phallus? Well, it's the signifier of the mother's desire. Again, so helpful. Like, I don't know. I still don't understand how having this signifier called the phallus is what makes somebody masculine opposed to feminine. But ultimately, this structure is in the background, and he doesn't really flesh it out. He takes it for granted. And I have a kind of hazy recollection that some of his arguments here are based on the concept of the phallus, but of course he doesn't clarify what all is involved with that.
Cool. Yeah, I wanted to make sure we touch on, like, he talks about the different kinds of symbols for women, right? You know, and like everyone's acquainted with the idea of, like, oh, there's the virgin, and that's imbued with all this culturally constructed meaning. Or there's the woman as the mother, right? So there's like the virgin, there's like the mother. These are idealized, but then there's also like the seductress, or
The Madonna and the whore to comedy.
servant, seductress, lover, saint. Yeah, and ultimately, what he's getting at is that these don't work, right, anymore. That it's almost like that various subcultures. There's no like mainframe culture, but various subcultures may still like try to enforce these in different extents, but like it's not like this thing that's what, unilateral or something.
And I actually wanted some clarification on one of the things that he said. It was on page 90 and talking about the ideas of the servant, seductress, lover, and saint. I believe he says, in traditional representation, a woman is in one place only insofar as she is also in another. So a woman is that which passes between two places. And I didn't really understand that. Like, I don't know. Does anyone have like any thoughts on that? I think he was just talking about how the servant and seductress and the lover and the saint all kind of like intertwine, and they aren't like separate distinctions between of the women as there are with the man. Like he's this, there's this. Whereas the woman's like kind of expected to be all of them, but that one particular line, I don't know.
I think he's talking about, so in another paragraph, he's talking about women being exchanged as commodities in the old system of marriage, where there was a dowry, and how you found your meaning basically by like, oh, you belong to this man, and now you're going to be going to this man, and then you'll be a mother, and then you'll be this, and so it's like you have like these roles, and they're all kind of like in this sequential like chain, and you better not fuck it up. I think that's what it is. You don't ever get to just be a human. You're like, so when you get married.
Yeah.
I'm not sure though, because he says this whole thing about like the power of two is even greater. It's like, what are you talking?
Yeah, he talks a lot about the 1 and 2, which was, I don't know.
Yeah. Cool. Do we have like a closing line or anything that we can read?
Page 44. I already read that.
Okay, maybe.
I just want to make like kind of a final remark though. Throughout all of this, he mentions the love a lot. I think in all 3 sections, he says, like love is the answer. Love is kind of part of the true life, but that doesn't necessarily just have to mean like relationship love. I think that extends into your passions and just doing things that you love in general, and going beyond the whole system of circulation of commodities and all of that, and that which then goes back to his idea of how you have to discover the things that you don't know that you're yet capable of, and just the passion and the desire to find the true life, the desire for new symbolization.
That was better than a quote, I think. Yeah. Yeah, ultimately that the the ideas like the good, ideas like peace, ideas like beauty, ideas like justice, or the truth. These are philosophical ideas. They cannot be contained in like a simple definition, and they're not something that you can ever achieve wholly and just have. Oh, I own it now. I've achieved beauty. I've achieved truth. I've achieved justice. That they are things that make life fundamentally worth living, and that it's the struggle and passion for those things that gives us meaning. That. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. What are we doing next? Really quick before we cut brief one here. Yeah. So on September 23rd, we're doing Transdisciplinarity Must Become Transversality by Guattari, which is like a 5-page essay. Tegan is really excited to unpack that with everybody. And there are, if you have a bunch of time, there's other stuff there as well. There's like other resources included. You just have to look at the Facebook event for that. Besides that, I think that there might be one other thing, but that it'll come in an email because it's not like nailed down just yet. So.
My computer's about to die, so I'm gonna stop this broadcast. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining, Mikey. It was great to have you. You really helped.
Yeah.
I was really hoping.
Thanks, everybody. See you for the next one.
Yep. Talk to you then.
Bye.